In 1888, an American excavation team was digging at Nippur, in what is now southern Iraq, when they started finding bowls. Ordinary bowls. Earthenware, the size of a dinner plate, the kind of thing you'd eat out of, turned on a wheel, fired at moderate heat, unglazed. They came up out of the foundations of houses, and they were all buried the same way, upside down. Remember that, the bowl is upside down. It matters more than it sounds, and we come back to it at the very end of the night. When they turned one over, the inside was covered in writing. Not a label, not a maker's mark, a dense spiral of tiny Aramaic script, starting at the rim and winding inward, round and round, tightening toward the center. And at the center of the spiral, in the middle of that vortex of words, somebody had drawn a figure, a woman, crudely rendered, with long, dishevelled hair. In many of the bowls, her hands and feet are bound. The bowls were not for food, they were traps. You wrote the spell inside, and you buried the bowl inverted beneath your threshold, or in the corner of a room, or under the bed where a woman was going to give birth, so that whatever came into the house would be caught underneath it, like a spider under a glass. Nearly every Jewish house excavated at that site had one. Something like 3,000 of these bowls are now known. And here is the part that stopped me. The text on many of them is not a prayer, it is not a curse, it is a legal document. It is written in the form of a writ of divorce, the standard Jewish legal instrument, with the correct formulas, naming the client and their mother, and serving notice on the defendant that the marriage is dissolved and she must leave the property. The defendant is not a person. In roughly a third of the published Jewish bowls, the defendant is named. She is called Lilith. Now, you almost certainly know a story about her, Adam's first wife, made from the same earth, at the same time, refusing to be beneath him, saying the unspeakable name of God and flying out of the garden. It's a story that turns up everywhere, in novels, in games, in television, in 100 articles. Most people who know anything about Lilith know that. That story appears in exactly one text, and that text was written somewhere between the 8th and the 10th centuries after Christ, more than 2,000 years after Genesis, and 300 years after the people at Nippur were already burying bowls to keep her out of their houses. The famous story is younger than the fear it explains. Somebody wrote the myth backwards. So tonight, where does Lilith actually come from? What is written on the bowls, and what were those households really afraid of? What does the Hebrew Bible say about her, because it's one line, and nobody agrees what it means? And which of the ancient origins everybody repeats has quietly collapsed under modern scholarship? This is what the night is for. A slow walk backwards through a story that has been told, across 2,000 years, in the wrong order. Starting where everyone starts, with the famous narrative, the one from the medieval text, the one about the garden and the argument and the flight, and then, layer by layer, going further back, until we reach something that is not a story at all, only a fear. A very old fear, pressing upward through the layers of explanation like water through packed earth, finding the surface in every century in whatever form the century had available. A bowl, a name, a writ of divorce, a piece of paper pinned above a crib, and eventually, in our own time, something stranger and wider and harder to define. You don't need to hold every detail tonight. This is a long, slow walk backwards through a story, one that has been waiting underground for a very long time, and you can drift off anywhere along the way. That's exactly right. The purpose isn't to arrive at the end having memorized every date and every scholar's name. There will be no test in the morning. The incantation bowls will still be in their museum drawers. The 3 angel names will still be inscribed on the 6th century clay. The alphabet of Ben Sira will still be dated to the 9th or 10th century, and the debate about what any of it means will still be running, patient and unresolved, in the journals and the seminars and the footnotes. This is the kind of history that works differently. It settles. It does its work while you sleep. It becomes, in the days after, a slightly altered sense of where something comes from. A small shift in the ground under a story you thought you knew. This is for the ones who like finding out where a thing actually came from. For the ones who feel something when they discover that a story everyone knows turns out to be younger than everyone assumes. That the custom existed before the explanation. That the practice was already running for centuries before anyone thought to write down why. If you have ever felt that particular satisfaction of peeling something back one layer further than the documentary did, if you have ever held an object in a museum and wondered about the hands that made it and the fear that drove them, this night was made for you. Close your eyes if you'd like. The screen can go dark. I'll keep talking, and the thread will be here whether you're following every word or drifting through it the way you drift through a room you know very well in the middle of the night. But first, I want to know where you are. What city, what country, what hour is it there right now? Leave it in the comments when you wake up, or right now if you're still awake enough. Someone is listening to this in a flat in Oslo just past 1 in the morning. Someone in Sao Paulo is getting ready for the day and found this by accident and decided to stay. Someone in a house in the Scottish Highlands has turned off every other light and is lying very still. Those are different kinds of dark, and I find I like knowing which one you're inside. If a gentle tap on the like button feels like the right thing before your eyes close, that's welcome. If not, that's equally right. You being here is already the right thing. Now, let's go back. All the way back, as far back as the objects and the texts and the careful, patient work of scholarship will take us. To a house in Nippur, to a lamp burning low, and to a scribe sitting on the floor with a bowl and a brush and a formula that someone had trusted long enough to pass down to him. The city of Nippur sits in the middle of what the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The Euphrates runs to the west, the Tigris to the east, and between them stretches a flat, pale plain that floods in spring and bakes in summer, and has been, for 10,000 years at least, one of the most continuously inhabited places on the surface of the earth. Cities have risen there and been buried and risen again on top of their own ruins, each layer pressing the one beneath it deeper into the alluvial soil. The ground in southern Iraq is not ground in the ordinary sense. It is a compressed archive. It is history packed so tightly into the earth that you cannot dig a garden without touching something that was once someone's life. Nippur was never a political capital. It was not the seat of any king who commanded armies or collected taxes or sent merchants out along the caravan routes. It was a religious centre, the home of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, the god of wind and storms and the space between heaven and earth. And because of that, it occupied a peculiar position in the political geography of the ancient world. Nippur was considered sacred ground, neutral ground, a city that belonged to all of Mesopotamia rather than to any single ruler. Empires rose and fell around it. Sargon of Akkad, Ur-Nammu, Nebuchadnezzar, they all came to Nippur to perform the rituals that would legitimate their rule. And because of that centrality, because of that sacred immunity, they almost universally left Nippur standing. It was too important to destroy. Destroying Nippur would have delegitimized the destroyer. By the time the American expedition arrived, in 1888, the city had been buried under its own debris for several centuries. The site was a series of low mounds rising from the flat plain, grass covered in spring, dusty and featureless for most of the year, the kind of thing you might walk past on the road and not look at twice, unless you knew what low mounds in that landscape sometimes meant. The expedition was organized by the University of Pennsylvania, one of the first major American archaeological ventures in the Near East, and it operated under Ottoman permit, with all the political delicacy that entailed. The team excavated in careful layers, working through the most recent debris first and pressing steadily downward through the centuries. The digging was slow, it was hot. The archaeologists worked through pottery fragments and collapsed mud brick walls, and the ghost traces of rooms that had long since dissolved back into the soil from which they were made. They were looking for inscribed objects, for tablets that would expand the known corpus of Mesopotamian texts, and they found them in significant numbers, adding to the collection of Sumerian and Akkadian literature that was, in the 1880s, only beginning to come into focus for Western scholarship. And then, from the foundations of houses, the bowls began to come up. They were unremarkable to look at, plain earthenware, unglazed, moderate quality, the kind of object that an archaeologist moving quickly might set aside without close attention. They ranged between 15 and 20 centimeters across, the size of a large soup bowl or a small platter, turned on a wheel in the ordinary way. Nothing about the exterior surface distinguished them from any other piece of domestic ceramic from the period. They would have blended into a table full of pottery sherds without difficulty. But they were buried upside down. That was the first thing. The team noted it. Bowls, found in deliberate positions in house foundations, all face down, not dumped in a refuse pile, not broken and discarded, but placed, set in position with the opening facing the earth. And when the team turned them over and brought a lamp close, the interior surfaces were covered in writing. The script was Aramaic, the common spoken and written language of the Near East in the late antique period, the language of the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, the language of the Talmud, the language that Jesus of Nazareth would have spoken in daily life. Some of the bowls were inscribed in Mandaic, the language of the Mandaean community, which maintains an unbroken tradition from the ancient world to the present day. A smaller number were in Syriac. The site had clearly been home to a multi-community settlement, Jewish, Mandaean, and Christian households living in proximity, each with its own scriptural and liturgical language, and yet all participating in what was, it appears, a shared regional practice. The writing on each bowl began at the rim and spiraled inward, each line following the curve of the clay, the spacing between lines consistent and careful, the hand steady. The scribe, whatever scribe had made any particular bowl, was a professional. This was not amateur work, not something a frightened household member had done themselves in the middle of the night, with whatever writing materials were to hand. The bowls bear the marks of craft, of training, of people who wrote this way often enough that the spiral was second nature, the pressure of the brush on the clay automatic, the formula coming from memory rather than from a reference. And at the center of the spiral, where the lines tightened to their final revolution around the heart of the bowl, there was a drawing. It was always, with variations, the same drawing. A human figure, female, rendered in a few strokes. A body, a head, hair that spreads outward and upward, as if blown by a wind that comes from directly below. The hair is the most consistent element. In the traditions associated with this kind of figure, wild or unbound hair is a marker of a state of crisis, of mourning, of something outside the ordinary social order. It is the opposite of the covered, ordered hair that marks a respectable woman in this world. The figure's hair is explicitly disordered. In many of the bowls, the hands and feet are shown bound, tied with something that might be rope or chain. In others, the posture suggests captivity or constraint without specific bindings. In all of them, the figure at the center of the spiral is a being that has been named, addressed, and in some sense restrained. The bowls were published, after years of study and translation, by a scholar named James A. Montgomery. His 1913 volume, Aramaic Incantation Texts from Nippur, is a foundational text in the study of Jewish magic in the ancient world, a careful, methodical work by a man who understood what he was looking at and gave it the serious scholarly attention it deserved. Montgomery had access to hundreds of bowls from the Pennsylvania excavation, and his translations and analyses established the framework that all subsequent scholarship on the subject has built on. The work of reading these bowls was not simple. The Aramaic script is small and sometimes crowded. The bowl's curved surface creates challenges for the pen that don't exist on a flat tablet. Some scribes were clearly more skilled than others, and some bowls show the signs of hurried or uncertain work. But even the less accomplished bowls follow the formulas closely enough to be effective, to be recognizable as members of the same genre, addressing the same threats in the same way. The genre itself had a stability that individual scribal skill did not determine. The formula was the thing, the scribe was the vehicle. Montgomery also established something else that subsequent scholars have confirmed and extended. The bowls are not primarily theological objects. They are not produced by the religious establishment, by rabbis or priests, or the official structures of Jewish religious life. They are commercial objects produced by a specialized class of scribes who may or may not have had formal religious training, serving a market of households with practical needs. The religious establishment and the bowl scribes coexisted, presumably in full awareness of each other, in the same communities. The Talmud was being compiled in academies in cities not far from Nippur, and yet the Talmud's silence on the practice of burying bowls, its acknowledgement of Lilith without any reference to the professional industry that was addressing her threat, suggests that the two traditions occupied different registers of religious life without quite intersecting: official religion and household religion, the academy and the floor of the house. The picture that emerged from his work was both mundane and arresting. These were household objects, made on commission for ordinary people, not temple equipment, not royal objects, not the property of priests or scholars or the wealthy. These were things that ordinary families in Nippur's Jewish quarter could buy from a local scribe when they felt their household was under threat. The process would have worked like this. A family feels that their home is not safe. Perhaps the wife is pregnant and they have lost children before. Perhaps there has been illness or unease, or the kind of recurring bad dreams that a community with a rich tradition of interpreting dreams will understand as significant. They go to the scribe. They tell him their names and their mother's names, because in this legal tradition, a person is identified by their own name and their mother's name, not their father's, for reasons scholars still discuss. They name the threat they face. They pay their fee. The scribe writes the bowl. The physical experience of watching that process, in the imagination. The clay is cool in the hand, slightly rough against the fingertips, with the particular weight of earthenware that has been fired and cooled. The scribe's lamp is an oil lamp, small, throwing warm and limited light. It is late, or early, or simply a working hour in the workshop where the scribe takes his commissions. He tilts the bowl toward the light so the interior surface is visible, and he begins to write. The brush moves with the confidence of repetition. This formula, this client, this name, this charge. Round and round, from the rim toward the center, the words accumulating in a slow inward spiral, and at the center, a few strokes for the figure. The constrained woman, the bound being, the resident of the bowl. Here is the part that most popular accounts of Lilith and Incantation bowls omit, because they stop at the general idea of protection against a demon, and do not go further. The specific legal form of many of these bowls is far stranger than that general description suggests. Many of the published Jewish bowls, perhaps the majority of them, are written not as prayers or curses or protective charms in the ordinary sense. They are written as a get. A get is a writ of divorce. It is the specific, formal, legally codified Jewish instrument for dissolving a marriage. It has a precise structure that has been in use, with adaptations, for more than 2,000 years and is still used in Jewish religious law today. A get must contain the names of both parties, must use specific formulas, must be written for the purpose of that specific dissolution and not recycled from another, must be delivered properly, and, critically, must be addressed to a person with legal standing. A get is not a statement of intention. It is a legal act that changes the status of two people in relation to each other. It is enforceable because words, properly formulated and properly witnessed, create binding obligations in the world. The incantation bowls follow the get formula precisely. They name the client by name and mother's name. They name the defendant. They recite, in correct legal sequence, the formulas of separation. Here is your divorce. Here is your writ. Here is your letter of separation. You are hereby divorced from this household. You are released. You have no further claim on this house, its walls, its threshold, its inhabitants, its children, its animals, its property, from this day and forever. And they name the defendant. Remember, it is a divorce document. Remember this moment. We come back to it much later in the night, when it will mean something different than it means right now. When the legal form of these bowls will illuminate something about how this whole tradition actually worked. Hold it lightly for now. A legal document, a writ, properly formulated, addressed to someone with standing to receive it. One bowl from the published corpus gives us names that have stayed with me since I first encountered them. The bowl was made for a man named Geonai bar Mamai and his wife, Rashnoi. Those are real names, real people. Geonai, son of Mamai, Rashnoi, daughter of her mother. The bowl records them with the same administrative precision a notary would use, not as characters in a story, but as clients in a transaction. And the writ the bowl contains reads, in translation, something close to this. Here is your divorce and writ and letter of separation, sent through holy angels. You are divorced from Geonai bar Mamai and from Rashnoi his wife. You are separated and cast out from their house, their threshold, their walls, their beds. You have no permission to harm them, or their children, or the children of their children, from this day and forever. The defendant named in that bowl is Lilith. Now hold 3 names. They will come back to you, further into the night, and when they come back they will be older than you expect. 3 names, strange and archaic even when they were first written: Senoi, Sansonoi, Semangalof. Hold them the way you hold something you don't yet have context for, lightly, without gripping, aware that they matter even before you know why. We will come back to them. The bowls from Nippur were not isolated objects. As the decades after Montgomery's publication passed, and as more sites in Mesopotamia were excavated or their collections examined, the scale of the phenomenon became clear. Bowls of the same general type, Aramaic, Mandaic, or Syriac incantation bowls, spirally inscribed, with a central figure buried in domestic contexts, were found across the region. Collections formed at the British Museum in London, at the Yale Babylonian Collection, at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, at the National Library of Israel, at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, at dozens of university collections and private holdings. Unprovenance bowls, objects that came onto the antiquities market without clear excavation records, continued to enter scholarly attention and be catalogued. The corpus grew. It continues to grow. More than 3,000 of these bowls are now known, and there is no clear reason to believe that represents the full picture. The date range of the bowls is roughly the 5th through the 8th century of the Common Era, the period of the Sasanian Empire, the last great Persian Empire before the Islamic conquest, and the 1st century of the Islamic period. This is the same period during which the Babylonian Talmud was being compiled and edited and reaching something like its final form. These communities, the households at Nippur and at similar sites across Mesopotamia, were Jewish, living under Sasanian rule in the world that produced the Babylonian Talmud. The bowls and the Talmud are products of the same cultural moment. They are in conversation with each other, even if the Talmud does not directly acknowledge the practice of burying bowls. The incantation bowl tradition is also not exclusively Jewish. The same period, the same region, and broadly the same practice generated bowls in Mandaic, the liturgical language of the Mandaean community, a religious group with roots in the ancient world that is still present, though much diminished, in parts of Iraq and Iran today. Mandaean bowls address similar concerns and invoke similar classes of protective powers, though the specific names and formulas differ. Christian Syriac language bowls have also been identified in the corpus, though they are less common. The practice of burying inscribed protective objects under house foundations appears to have been shared across the religious communities of late antique Mesopotamia, not exclusively Jewish, not exclusively any single tradition, but embedded in the regional household culture broadly enough that it crossed the boundaries between communities that in other respects maintained careful distinctions. This matters because it tells you something about the nature of the fear being addressed, a fear that crosses community lines, that leads Jewish households and Mandaean households and Christian households in the same region to adopt broadly similar protective measures, is a fear rooted in something more basic than any single religious tradition's theology. It is rooted in the conditions of life in that region, in that period, in the mortality rates, in the vulnerabilities of infancy, in the darkness that was a genuine and profound darkness before electric light, in the way the night felt from inside a house made of mud brick, in a city that had no street lighting, and whose sounds, after midnight, were the sounds of a world with no human observers. Nearly every Jewish house excavated at Nippur had one. Think about what that means. This was not a fringe practice, not the recourse of the desperate or the uneducated, or those outside the mainstream of Jewish religious life. It was normal. It was expected. A Jewish household without a protective bowl was, in some sense, an exposed household, the way a household without a mezuzah on the doorpost might have felt exposed to a community with strong traditions about doorpost markings. The bowl was household hardware, an ordinary feature of an ordinary domestic life. An ordinary domestic life organized around the specific, named, legally addressed threat of Lilith. Which brings us to the question that all of this material presses us toward. What did these households believe she was? Not the story comes later, and we will read it carefully. What was the fear? What kind of being requires a divorce document? What does it mean to serve legal papers on whatever walks in the night? To answer that, we have to read the one text that gives us a full account. And to read that text properly, we have to understand how old it is and how young. There is a text called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. You will not find it in the standard canon of Hebrew scripture. It is not in the Torah, not among the prophets, not in the writings. It does not appear in the Catholic Deuterocanon, or in most Protestant collections of the Apocrypha. It is what scholars sometimes call a parabiblical text, a work that exists in the orbit of scripture, that engages with biblical themes and characters and modes, that circulated widely within Jewish communities, but that was never granted the status of sacred scripture itself. The Alphabet of Ben Sira is also a deeply strange book, even by the standards of medieval Hebrew literature, which is a category containing a great deal of strangeness. The alphabet is unusual in its tone, moving between solemnity and broad, coarse humor without apparent transition, addressing subjects that a writer working in a purely reverential register would have left alone. It is attributed to Ben Sira, a biblical sage, but the attribution is a literary device rather than a historical claim. Its full title is Alphabetum Siracidis, and it structures its material alphabetically, which is a well-established device in Hebrew literary tradition. But the content moves in directions that the structural elegance of the alphabetical frame does not quite account for. It is, in short, a difficult text to read, difficult to characterize, difficult to assign a straightforward purpose to. And in the middle of this difficult, strange, irreverent book, there is a passage that has become one of the most widely reproduced, most frequently cited, most deeply influential pieces of text in all of Jewish religious literature. This is the passage about Lilith. It addresses the creation, specifically a puzzle that careful readers of Genesis have always noticed. The book contains what appear to be two distinct accounts of the creation of human beings, which sit in a certain tension with each other. In the first chapter of Genesis, God creates humanity. Male and female he created them, in a single act, simultaneously. In the second chapter, the sequence is different. God forms the man from the dust of the earth, and only later, from the man's rib or side, creates the woman. These two accounts have been the subject of scholarly and theological discussion for centuries. They read, to many careful eyes, as different traditions about the same event, preserved side by side rather than harmonized. The alphabet of Ben Sira reads that tension as a story. It offers an account of what happened between those two creation narratives, what the first chapter describes and what the second chapter revises, and it does so by introducing a character. In the beginning, the text says, God created Adam, and at the same time, from the same earth, in the same moment, through the same process, God created Lilith. Not from Adam's side, not from any part of him, not derived or secondary, but independently, from the earth, the way Adam was created, directly, equally, by the same hands and the same breath. Two beings formed simultaneously in the same act, breathing the same first breath at the same first moment, standing up from the ground of Eden at the same instant with no ordering between them. The text lingers on this for a reason. It wants you to understand that what follows is not a story about a lesser being failing to accept her place. It is a story about two beings who are genuinely, structurally equal, and who cannot find a way to live with each other. This matters enormously for what follows. Two beings, created simultaneously, from identical material, by the same act. The text establishes their equality at the moment of creation, so that everything that comes next is understood correctly, as a dispute between equals, not as a rebellion of the lesser against the greater. Adam wants Lilith to lie beneath him. She refuses. The reason she gives is one of those statements that arrives in a story and then refuses to leave the mind. We are equal. We were made from the same earth. We were made at the same time. We were made in the same way. What reason, she says, can there be for me to be beneath you? The argument does not resolve. They argue, and neither gives way, and the dispute reaches a point where it cannot continue, and also cannot end. And at that point, Lilith does something that carries, in the world the text describes, a weight that no other act could equal. She speaks the name of God. The name, the unspeakable name, the name that is written in the Torah but never spoken aloud, the name that has accumulated around itself, over millennia, a vast tradition of substitutes and circumlocutions and careful avoidances, the name that observant Jewish practice replaces with Adonai or Hashem or simply the Lord. That name, Lilith speaks. And the speaking of it gives her what no other act of defiance could give, wings, the ability to leave. She rises into the air and flies out of the garden, over the walls, over the boundary of the world she was made to inhabit, toward the Red Sea. God sends 3 angels after her. Their names are Senoi, Sansanoi, and Semangelof, the 3 names you are holding. They fly to the Red Sea and find her there, and deliver the message, return to Adam. If you do not, 100 of your children will die every day. Lilith does not return. she makes a counter-proposal instead. This is the part of the story that tends to be omitted from popular retellings, and its omission changes the character of what the text is actually doing. She does not simply refuse and accept the punishment. She negotiates. She tells the angels, "I have been given power over newborns, over male infants in the first 8 days of life, over female infants in the first 20. I will not give that up." But she agrees that any infant whose home bears the names of the 3 angels will be safe from her. She will not touch the children of houses that display those names. And then she goes back to the Red Sea, and she stays there, and she does not return to Adam. The story is elegant. It works. It explains the practice of inscribing the 3 angel names on amulets and placing them above newborns. It explains why Lilith appears in protective texts. It provides a biography for the being whose name fills the incantation bowls, a history, a motivation, a specific account of how she came to be what she is and what holds power over her. It is, as a piece of explanatory narrative, remarkably well designed. It is also, for its time and its tradition, unusually complex in its portrayal. The Lilith of the alphabet of Ben Sira is not simply a monster. She is a being who makes a principled argument for her own equality, and who refuses to abandon that argument even when confronted with loss. She loses the garden, she loses Adam, she loses the life she was made for, and she accepts the loss rather than submit. The deal she makes at the Red Sea is a deal entirely on her own terms. She names her conditions. She sets the price. She addresses the angels as negotiating counterparts. Whether the text intends this as characterization of a particular kind of dangerous autonomy, or whether something more sympathetic is present, is one of the things readers have always found differently depending on what they brought to the text, which is, in its own way, a mark of stories that endure. The ones that last are the ones that can be read from multiple directions simultaneously. The story is told in a remarkably small number of words. The alphabet of Ben Sira does not dwell on the encounter. It moves with the brisk economy of a text that trusts its readers to fill in the gaps, to understand the weight of each detail, the significance of each choice. The argument between Adam and Lilith is rendered in a few lines of reported speech. The flight takes a sentence. The pursuit by the angels is brief. And the deal at the Red Sea, the strange, asymmetrical negotiation in which Lilith gives up return to the garden in exchange for the right to be the threat that the protective names can contain, that deal is outlined in the space of a paragraph. What the text gives you, in those few words, is a cosmology, a story in which the creation is not a simple act but a complicated one, in which equality at the moment of origin does not prevent conflict, in which the conflict is not resolved but managed, and in which the management involves names and bowls and spirals of writing pressed into clay. The story explains why the practice exists. It provides the justification that the practice was implicitly asking for, and it does so in a form that is easy to remember, easy to transmit, and internally coherent, which is why it lasted. But step back from the elegance of the narrative for a moment and look at what it actually claims. The alphabet of Ben Sira says that Lilith was Adam's first wife, made at the moment of creation, and that her story explains the practice of protective amulets and bowls. That is the claim. And the claim requires the reader to accept that the story is old enough to explain a practice that, by the 9th or 10th century, was already ancient. The story presents itself as origin. It says, this is where the fear comes from. This is where the names come from. This is why the bowls work. The problem, the elegant, precise, historically devastating problem, is that the bowls are older than the story. The story cannot be the origin of the practice because the practice was already running before the story was written. And there is exactly one thing about it that changes everything. The text, the alphabet of Ben Sira, was written somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries of the Common Era. The scholarly consensus places its composition in that range, with some arguing for an earlier date within that window, some for a later one. The narrowest scholarly estimates suggest the late 9th or early 10th century. This puts the text roughly 900 years after the beginning of the Common Era, and somewhere between 900 and 1200 years after the composition of the earliest rabbinic texts. The bowls from Nippur are dated to the 5th through 7th centuries of the Common Era. Some scholars would date the earliest to the late 4th. The bowls predate the alphabet of Ben Sira by a minimum of 200 years. By most estimates, the gap is 300 years or more, which means the story in the alphabet of Ben Sira was not the source of the practice. It was not the text that introduced people to the idea of protecting against Lilith with inscribed names. The practice was already running, already embedded in Jewish household life in Mesopotamia, already generating a professional class of scribes who made the bowls, already producing legal documents addressed to a named demon, long before anyone wrote down the story that supposedly explains why. And here is the thing that the outline of this story presses on. There is exactly one line about Lilith in the entire Hebrew Bible, one verse, in one poem, in one chapter, in one book, not a prominent position, not a central narrative, one line, in a list. Hold that. We are not going to look at it yet, not for a while, not until we've gone back through several more layers, but hold it. The famous story is only the 9th or 10th century. Genesis is from the 1st millennium before Christ. The Hebrew Bible was composed across centuries, compiled and edited and canonized, and in all of that time, in all of the Torah, all of the prophets, all of the writings, there is one line that may refer to Lilith, and nobody agrees on what it means. Now here is the question that the rest of the night is organized around. If the story is medieval, if the single line in the Hebrew Bible is ambiguous, if the bowls are older than the story, where does the fear come from? What is at the bottom of this? What is the thing that was old enough to need a name, old enough that households were already serving it with legal documents before anyone thought to explain why? To find that, we have to go deeper, layer by layer, text by text, backwards through time. But first, we need to spend a little time with the alphabet of Ben Sira itself, because there is something important to say about this text before we leave it, something that changes how you read the story it tells. Let's stay with the alphabet for a moment longer, because it asks something of us that most retellings of Lilith's story don't. The book is strange in a way that is hard to convey without reading it in full. Its strangeness is not incidental, not a matter of translation difficulty or the distance of centuries. It is fundamental to what the text appears to be doing. The alphabet mixes registers that other texts keep carefully apart. It is reverent and irreverent in the same breath. It quotes scripture and then places next to the scriptural quotation a story that seems to be mocking the very tradition it appears to be transmitting. It is the kind of text that makes careful scholars pause and ask, what is this for? What was it doing in the world? Who was reading it, and how? One of the most significant answers to those questions came from a scholar named David Stern, who proposed, and this is the claim, stated plainly, that the alphabet of Ben Sira is the first example of parody in classical rabbinic literature. Not merely a text with humorous elements, not merely a text that takes liberties with convention. A text that is, in its fundamental design, a work of sustained literary satire, one that uses the forms of serious religious writing to produce effects that subvert those forms from within. If Stern is right, then the Lilith passage was written as a joke. Let that sit in the quiet of the room for a moment, without rushing forward. The story of Lilith and Adam, and the argument about equality and the Red Sea and the angels and the pact, the story that has generated more commentary, more feminist theology, more fantasy fiction, more therapeutic frameworks, more Kabbalistic elaboration, more cultural remaking across more centuries and more countries than perhaps any other single passage in medieval Jewish religious literature, may have been, in its author's intention, a piece of comic writing, something written to make a sophisticated audience laugh at the solemnity with which protective customs were often explained, a parody of the kind of text that produces a story about where a practice comes from. And if the author wrote it as a parody, and if the audience received it seriously, and if the serious reception then became the foundation for centuries of mystical elaboration and cultural meaning, then the tradition itself is built on a misreading. The joke became the teaching. Let's sit with that possibility for a moment, because it is worth sitting with. Most popular accounts of Lilith's history treat the alphabet of Ben Sira as simply a record, a document that preserved something that was already known, that wrote down a tradition that had been circulating in oral form, that gave textual permanence to something that already had cultural permanence. That reading is possible, but it is not the only reading, and it may not be the most accurate one. If the alphabet was written as parody, if the author was doing something sophisticated and ironic with the conventions of etiological narrative, using the form of "this is why we do what we do" to produce a comic effect rather than a theological statement, then the reception of the text as serious religious teaching represents a remarkable historical event. The joke became canonical. The parody became the foundation. What was written to be laughed at was taken up as inherited wisdom, elaborated by mystics and given cosmological weight, and then transmitted across 1,000 years and 12 countries as received truth. That would not be unprecedented. The history of religion is full of texts that survived their original context and found new purposes their authors did not foresee. It would be extraordinary, but extraordinary things happen, especially to texts that touch on fears as deep as the fear of infant death. Other scholars hold the opposite view, and with equal confidence. Louis Ginzberg, the great compiler of Jewish legendary tradition, whose 6-volume Legends of the Jews has been in continuous use by scholars for more than a century, read the Lilith passage in the alphabet as genuine folk tradition, as something that had been circulating orally in Jewish communities long enough to have acquired the authority of received wisdom, and that the alphabet was recording rather than inventing. Ginzberg was not troubled by the text's idiosyncrasies. He treated the Lilith passage as authentic transmission, a piece of popular belief that had survived precisely because it was believed. So which is it? The honest answer, and tonight is committed to honest answers, is that scholars still argue. The field is genuinely divided. This is not the kind of disagreement that will be resolved by a new discovery or a better translation. It is a disagreement about how to read a multivalent text, and those disagreements are the kind that productive scholarly communities sustain indefinitely, as they should. The disagreement itself is evidence of the text's richness, a text that can credibly support both readings without either one exhausting it. What Gershom Scholem argued, and Scholem is perhaps the most significant scholar of Jewish mysticism that the 20th century produced, the person who more than anyone else brought Kabbalah into serious academic study, was a reading that navigates between the two positions. The alphabet of Ben Sira, Scholem wrote, sets out to explain the already widespread custom of writing amulets against Lilith. The text is, on this reading, an etiology, a story written to provide an origin for a practice that already existed, not a parody, not a transmission of ancient oral tradition, but a medieval composition designed to answer a question that the bowls and the amulets were asking without answering. Where does this practice come from? Why these 3 names? Why a writ of divorce? Why Lilith specifically? The alphabet of Ben Sira, in Scholem's reading, was the answer someone composed to those questions. a narrative explanation for an already existing ritual tradition. The story was written to fit the practice. The practice was primary. This is the reading that feels most consistent with what we know from the bowls. The bowls are from the 5th, 6th, 7th century. The story is from the 9th or 10th. In between those dates, the practice was already in full force, already professional, already producing thousands of objects, without a standardized narrative explanation for why. The alphabet steps in to fill that gap. It provides the story that the bowls were implicitly asking for. Now I want to plant something in the room with you, something we're going to return to when we've gone further back. There are two pieces of evidence that almost everyone cites when they write about Lilith's ancient origins. Two proofs of her deep Mesopotamian roots, her connection to the very beginnings of civilization, her pedigree reaching back 4,000 years. These are the Gilgamesh connection and the Arslan Tash amulets. You will find them in almost every popular account of Lilith's history. They are presented as established facts. Both of them have been significantly challenged by modern scholarship. Both of them are less secure than almost everyone writing about Lilith on the internet knows. The ancient pedigree that everyone cites may be much thinner than it appears. We're going to look at those two pieces of evidence carefully, later in the night, when we reach the Mesopotamian layer. We're going to look at what the evidence actually says, and what scholars who work with these primary sources actually think. And what we find is going to be more interesting and more unsettling than the confident version most people have encountered. There is a third lens worth naming before we leave this layer, because it represents a position that serious scholars hold and that deserves to be treated fairly rather than dismissed. This is the continuity reading, the view that the alphabet of Ben Sira, whatever its tone and whatever its compositional history, was drawing on something genuinely ancient, on an oral tradition that ran parallel to the written one, that the text recorded rather than invented, and that had its own deep roots in the older layers of the tradition. On this reading, the absence of the story from the Talmud and from canonical scripture does not mean the story is late. It means the story circulated in channels that the Talmud and the canonical corpus did not transmit, in domestic, popular, oral tradition, rather than in the scholarly, textual tradition that left the most durable written record. Three lenses then: Parody, a late composition designed to explain existing practice, and a genuinely ancient oral tradition finally committed to writing. All three are live in the field. None of them can be definitively ruled out with the evidence currently available. What that means is not that the truth is inaccessible. It means that the most honest account of where the story comes from acknowledges the genuine uncertainty, and that the uncertainty is itself meaningful. It tells us something about how the tradition worked, how it moved in channels the written record doesn't capture, how it accumulated authority without leaving trails that would allow us to trace it cleanly, how something can be widely known in a community without being written down until centuries after it first circulated. Nothing tonight is a claim about what is spiritually or religiously true. That conversation belongs somewhere else, and to people whose relationship to the tradition gives them standing to have it. This is the history of where a story comes from, and the honest answer involves several scholars disagreeing, several pieces of evidence that point in different directions, and several centuries that left objects but not explanations. The story runs backwards in more ways than one. The famous origin story is younger than the fear, and the famous ancient pedigree is less established than the popular accounts admit. Every layer of this history, when you look at it carefully, turns out to be both older and younger than you expected. Older in the fear, younger in the explanation, and more uncertain at the bottom than any simple account of origin makes it sound. We go backwards now, into the earlier layers, the Talmud first. The Babylonian Talmud is one of the great texts of human civilization, not merely of Jewish civilization, though it is certainly that. but of human attempts to organize communal life through the disciplined and rigorous examination of every question that life raises. Its composition stretched across several centuries, with the editing and compilation reaching something like a stable form around the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, which places it, with some precision, in exactly the same world as the Incantation bowls. The Babylonian Talmud was produced in Mesopotamia, in the academies of Sura and Pumbedita, by communities of Jewish scholars living under Sasanian rule. The households that buried bowls in their floors, and the scholars who debated legal and theological questions in the academies, were part of the same world. Neighbors, sometimes, related, often, aware of each other's practices, certainly. This makes the Talmud's treatment of Lilith both intimate and oblique. Intimate because the Talmud's framers lived in the same community as the bowl buriers and presumably knew about the practice. Oblique because the Talmud, as a genre, does not work like a systematic theological treatise. It moves by association and accumulation, addressing a question on its way to addressing another question, never quite settling into the kind of definitive statement that would allow a single reading to foreclose all others. There are several passages in the Babylonian Talmud that mention Lilith. They do not cohere into a single portrait. They address different aspects of a threat that the Talmud appears to assume its readers already know, without feeling the need to define. The most striking is in the tractate Shabbat. It is dangerous for a man to sleep alone in a house, because Lilith may seize him. The warning is practical rather than mythological. It appears in a context of legal discussion about the Sabbath, not in a narrative context about supernatural beings. It is addressed to the reader as a piece of practical knowledge, the way a warning about leaving a pot of boiling water unattended might be practical knowledge. The danger is assumed to be real. The response, "Don't sleep alone," is assumed to be achievable. The text does not explain why Lilith presents this danger, or what exactly happens when she seizes someone. It simply states the fact and moves on. This is telling. The Talmud's framers are not introducing Lilith to their readers. They are mentioning something the readers already know. The warning makes no sense if the reader has no prior concept of what Lilith is, or why sleeping alone would be relevant to her. This is shorthand, the reference to a shared knowledge base that the text assumes everyone holds. What that tells us is that Lilith, as a category of threat, was already embedded deeply enough in Jewish folk knowledge in Mesopotamia in the 5th or 6th century that the Talmud could refer to her without explanation. Another passage describes Lilith as having long hair and wings. These physical details are significant not because they tell us what she objectively is. The Talmud's framers would have found that question puzzling, and perhaps beside the point, but because they tell us what the image of her was at this stage of the tradition: long hair, disordered, wings. These are the features of something that moves through the air, something that is not fully of the earth, something that arrives and departs without using the door. The image coordinates with the bound figure at the center of the incantation bowls. Dishevelled hair, contained by the spiral of words, stopped at the threshold. The bowl and the Talmudic description are pointing at the same thing from different angles. A third passage appears in a discussion of birth anomalies. In the tractate Niddah, there is a form of birth that has been taken to imply a connection with Lilith, and it is listed alongside other categories of unusual birth for the purposes of legal discussion. The passage is brief, technical, and not obviously theological, but its presence in a medical legal discussion signals something important. Lilith is not, at this stage, merely a figure of speech or a purely metaphorical danger. She is something the rabbis take seriously enough to consider in concrete discussions of real-world situations. What the Talmud does not contain, what is entirely absent from its several hundred folios, is the story of Adam's first wife. The dispute, the equality, the pronouncing of the name, the flight, the Red Sea, the angels, the pact. None of that is there. Lilith exists in the Talmud as a genuine category of threat, specifically and concretely dangerous to men sleeping alone and to newborns, with a recognizable physical form. But the specific narrative that makes her famous, the story that gives her a biography and a motivation and a relationship to the creation, that is not Talmudic. It comes later. There is something worth pausing on in how the Talmud handles Lilith, because the way the Talmud handles something tells you nearly as much as what it says. The Talmud is not a text that shies away from difficult material. It debates the existence and nature of demons, discusses the proper ritual response to supernatural encounters, acknowledges the reality of forces that operate outside the visible world. Its framers were not unsophisticated readers trying to explain things they did not understand. They were sophisticated readers, deeply familiar with their tradition, making deliberate choices about what to include, how to include it, and how much weight to give it. The fact that Lilith appears in the Talmud in scattered references, in passing, without a sustained discussion of her nature or origin, tells you something about her status in the tradition at this stage. She is assumed. She does not need to be introduced. The Talmud's framers mention her the way you mention something everybody already knows, briefly, as a reference point, without the explanatory apparatus you'd provide for something unfamiliar. But she is also, at this stage, specifically threatening and specifically practical. The Talmud is, above all, a practical text, a text concerned with how to live correctly in the world, how to navigate the requirements of Jewish law in real circumstances, how to make the right decisions when abstract principles meet concrete situations. Lilith's presence in this text is not philosophical or mystical. It is practical. Don't sleep alone. Here is why. This is what might happen. This is what is at stake. The practicalness of it is, in its own way, sobering. The Talmud is not decorating its pages with mythology. It is giving legal guidance to communities it assumes will follow it. When it tells you not to sleep alone, it means it. Now we go further back, past the Talmud, into the desert. In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib was looking for a lost goat near the shore of the Dead Sea in the Judean desert. He threw a stone into a crack in the limestone cliff above him to see if the goat had taken shelter there. He heard the sound of pottery breaking. He went up to look, and he found a cave full of clay jars. Inside the jars were ancient scrolls. What followed, slowly, controversially, with decades of scholarly arguments about access and publication and authenticity and interpretation, was one of the most significant discoveries in the history of archaeology and religious studies. The Dead Sea Scrolls turned out to be the library of a Jewish community, almost certainly the Essenes, who had hidden their books in the caves of the Judean desert sometime around 70 of the Common Era, when the Roman destruction of Jerusalem was becoming inevitable. The scrolls ranged in date from the 3rd century before Christ to the 1st century of the Common Era. They included the oldest known copies of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible, in forms remarkably close to the texts we have today, and they included texts that had not been in anyone's canon, compositions, hymns, rules, liturgical pieces that had been lost for 2,000 years. Among those non-canonical texts was one called the Songs of the Sage. The Songs of the Sage is a liturgical composition, a collection of hymns or formulaic recitations intended for use in ritual. Its apparent purpose is apotropaic, the warding off of harmful spirits. It reads as something that might be recited aloud in a ritual context, perhaps by a specialist, perhaps communally, to protect a space or a person or a community from spiritual harm. And in its catalogue of the spirits to be warded against, it includes Liliths. Not Lilith, Liliths, plural. Sit with that distinction, because it matters more than it initially sounds. At this stage of the tradition, the last few centuries before the Common Era, more than 1,000 years before the alphabet of Ben Sira, there is no character named Lilith, with a biography and a relationship to Adam, and a specific deal with specific angels. There is a category of beings called Liliths, a type, a class. The way there might be a class of beings called demons or spirits or night creatures, without any specific one of them having a name and a story and a face. Lilith, at this stage, is a noun before it becomes a name, a word for a category of threat before it becomes a proper noun designating an individual. The Songs of the Sage names Liliths alongside other threatening classes of beings, in a list, a catalogue, an enumeration of what the ritual is designed to protect against. This is not a narrative text. It is not telling a story about what Liliths are, or where they come from, or what they want. It is simply acknowledging their existence as a category of threat that requires ritual countermeasure. What that tells us is significant. When you trace the tradition backwards, from the famous medieval story, through the Talmud's scattered references, to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the trajectory runs toward greater generality rather than greater specificity. The closer you get to the beginning, the less individuated Lilith becomes. She starts as a type, gradually acquires a recognizable physical form, accumulates legal significance, becomes the subject of professional countermeasures, and only at the very end of the tradition, in a 9th century text that may be a parody, gets a biography, a history, a proper name that belongs to an individual rather than a class. This is not the pattern of a historical figure being remembered over time. That pattern runs the other direction. The further back you go, the sharper and more specific the evidence gets. This is the pattern of a folk category gradually condensing into a character, a fear acquiring a face, a class of threat becoming, over centuries, a single named entity with a story that explains her. This is what the evidence looks like when you read it in the direction it points, rather than the direction the famous story implies. The alphabet of Ben Sira presents its narrative as original, as the thing that came first, the origin that explains everything that followed. But the evidence runs the other way. The general category is oldest. The individual biography is newest. The direction of travel is from plural to singular, from type to character, from noun to name. And this, in turn, raises a question worth holding as we keep going backwards. If the tradition really does develop in this direction, from category to individual, then what was the category? What is the oldest layer of fear that eventually condensed into this specific shape? What were people afraid of before they had a name for it that carried a biography? Now pause. We have gone from the medieval story to the Talmud to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and at each step the evidence has become older and less specific. We are going to go one step further back before we return to the Mesopotamian layer, to the one verse in the Hebrew Bible where a word that might be her name appears. But first, a pause in the journey, because we've been going for a while and the night is long, and the best part of a long night is the middle of it, when you've been deep enough, long enough, that the shapes of things start to look different. Where are you in the world right now? What does the room feel like? If you're still awake, or halfway between, or coming back from a drift, leave it below. Someone is listening to this in a city I've never been to, in a country where the language I speak is not spoken, in a room I cannot picture. Someone is awake in a house that contains a sleeping child and has been awake for hours. Someone came to this from somewhere else entirely and stayed longer than they planned. All of those are the right thing. We keep going, to Isaiah, to the one line that may or may not be her name. Isaiah 34 is a poem of destruction. The book of Isaiah is one of the longest and most theologically complex books of the Hebrew Bible, attributed to the prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem, but almost certainly the product of multiple writers across a long period. Chapter 34 is addressed to the nations generally, and to Edom specifically, Edom being a nation that occupied the land to the south and east of Judah, and was, across much of the biblical period, understood as Judah's enemy, rival, and shadow self. The chapter describes what will happen to Edom when God's judgment finally falls. Total, permanent, catastrophic destruction. The mountains will drip with blood, the streams will turn to pitch, and the land will burn with a fire that does not go out. The soil will become sulfur. And then, in one of those sudden pivots that makes biblical poetry so striking, the tone shifts from cosmic destruction to something almost domestic. Once Edom is completely ruined, what will live there? The answer is a list. A long, carefully assembled catalogue of the creatures of desolation, the beings that occupy a landscape after human civilization has withdrawn from it. Jackals and ostriches, great owls and screech owls, wild goats dancing on the ruined walls, hyenas, ravens, the animals of the empty places. The list is specific and ecological. These are not metaphorical creatures. They are the actual animals that would colonize an abandoned landscape in that part of the world. And then, embedded in the list, a word, one Hebrew word, Lilith. That is its only appearance in the entire corpus of the Hebrew Bible. One word, in a list of animals, in a destruction poem, about Edom. The problem is immediately apparent when you begin to look at how this word has been translated. English Bibles do not agree. The King James Version, translated in 1611, renders it screech owl, treating the word as the name of a bird, a nocturnal species associated with desolation. The New Revised Standard Version gives night creature. The New International Version gives night creatures in the plural. The New Jerusalem Bible says Lilith, and some older translations, less cautious about introducing extra-biblical associations, say night hag or night spirit, importing a demonic register that the surrounding context, a list of mundane desert animals, does not obviously support. Why can't translators agree? Because the Hebrew word's etymology is genuinely disputed. The word may derive from the Hebrew root for night, lail, in which case it is simply a word meaning something like night thing or night creature, parallel to the other nocturnal animals in the list. Or it may be a proper name with a separate origin, in which case it is the only canonical biblical reference to the being who will later appear in the bowls and the alphabet of Ben Sira. Scholars like Judith M. Blair have argued carefully and at length that the word in Isaiah 34 is best understood as a species name or category, a night creature or night bird, parallel to the screech owl and the great owl that appear in the same list, with no intended reference to any supernatural being. On this reading, Lilith does not appear in the Hebrew Bible at all. There is only a night bird in a list of night birds, in a destruction poem, about a country that no longer exists. This is not a fringe reading. It is a mainstream scholarly position, and its implications are significant. If it is correct, then the entire tradition of Lilith, the bowls, the Talmud, the medieval story, the millennia of protective practice, developed without any canonical biblical foundation. It grew up beside the Bible rather than from it. It was folk religion, household practice, local belief, rich and deep and enduring, but not rooted in Scripture the way the famous story would suggest. The implications extend further. If there is no Lilith in the Hebrew Bible, if the one word that might be her name turns out to be a night bird in a list of night birds, then the famous story of Lilith as Adam's first wife is not filling in a gap that Scripture left open. It is not completing a narrative that the canonical text began and failed to finish. It is, instead, a medieval composition that placed a figure from folk tradition into a biblical frame, that gave an existing belief a scriptural pedigree it may never have actually had. The story presents itself as explaining Genesis. But if there is no Lilith in Genesis, the explanation is a retroactive construction, a story that reached back into Scripture and found a place for a character who was not originally there. This is, again, not unusual in the history of religious literature. The process of reading existing characters into existing texts, of finding scriptural warrant for beliefs that circulated outside the scriptural tradition, is normal and well documented. What is unusual in this case is how cleanly the evidence allows us to see the construction happening, because the bowls are still in the ground, and the dates are still calculable, and the direction of travel is still legible. Let that land very quietly. The most famous first wife in religious and literary history may not appear in the canonical text of Judaism even once. The one word that points toward her may be a bird. Now we go to Mesopotamia. We are going to look very carefully at the two pieces of evidence that everyone cites as proof of Lilith's ancient Babylonian origins, and we are going to look at what the scholarship actually says about them now. The first piece of evidence is called the Gilgamesh connection. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest substantial work of narrative literature in human history, or at least the oldest that we have been able to reconstruct from surviving texts, which is not quite the same thing, but close enough for tonight's purposes. It describes the adventures of the hero king Gilgamesh of Uruk, his friendship with the wild man Enkidu, their shared battles against supernatural opponents, Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh's grief and his quest for immortality, and his eventual failure to obtain it. It is a profound text, genuinely, unexpectedly moving across a distance of 4,000 years. Alongside the main epic, there are Sumerian narrative poems about Gilgamesh that predate the Akkadian version and that share some characters and themes. One of these Sumerian poems concerns a tree, a willow tree, or hulupu tree, that the goddess Inanna plants in her garden with the intention of eventually cutting it down to make furniture from its wood. 3 unwelcome residents take up residence in the tree: a serpent in the roots, a bird called the Anzu in the crown, and, in the trunk, a being described as Kisikil lil Lake. That phrase, Kisikil lil Lake, has been translated by certain 20th century scholars as the Lilith, and from that translation a whole narrative of ancient origin was constructed. The Lila of the Sumerian became the Lilitu of the Akkadian, became the Lilith of the Hebrew, and therefore Lilith has traceable roots in the very beginnings of Sumerian civilization, 4,000 years ago. Here is the problem. Modern Sumerologists, scholars who actually specialize in reading Sumerian cuneiform, in understanding Sumerian grammar and vocabulary, do not accept this translation. The compound ki sikil lil la ke is a complex term in Sumerian, and its components do not straightforwardly map onto the Hebrew Lilith. The Lilith translation was proposed in the early to mid-20th century, when Sumerology was a young discipline with many open questions, and it was repeated in popular and semi-popular accounts, often enough that it became the accepted version. But the scholars who work with Sumerian texts now are much more cautious. Several of them argue that the term designates a category of female spirit with no necessary linguistic connection to the Hebrew tradition at all. The translation Lilith in the Gilgamesh Hulupu tree appendix appears to have entered the popular record because it made for a better story, because it connected the dots in a way that was satisfying and coherent, rather than because the Sumerian evidence supports it. The dots, it turns out, may not connect. The second piece of evidence is the Arslan Tash amulets. Arslan Tash is a site in northern Syria, the ancient Assyrian city of Hadatu, where excavations in the 1920s produced a series of inscribed amulets. Some of these amulets were subsequently read as bearing inscriptions protective against a being whose name resembled Lilith, and they were dated by some scholars to the 7th century before the Common Era. If that dating and that reading were correct, they would represent the earliest known reference to Lilith by name, predating the Dead Sea Scrolls by several centuries and pushing the tradition back into the 1st millennium BCE. The problems with the Arslan Tash amulets are significant. Their authenticity has been questioned. Some scholars have raised concerns about whether the amulets were excavated from the site, as reported, or whether they entered the antiquities market in ways that call their provenance into question. The dating has been disputed, with some specialists arguing for a much later date than the 7th century. And the reading of the inscription as a reference to Lilith has been challenged on paleographic and linguistic grounds. The amulets are not definitively authenticated, their dating is contested, and the reading of them as early evidence for Lilith is not the consensus position in the field. Neither of these challenges means that Lilith has no ancient roots. The point is more specific. The two pieces of evidence that almost everyone cites to establish those ancient roots are both significantly disputed by the scholars who actually work with the primary materials. The popular account is more confident than the evidence supports. What does remain reasonably solid is the linguistic family connection. There really are beings in Akkadian religious texts called Lilitu, female spirits associated with wind, with the night, with sexual threat, and the threatening of infants. The word Lilitu exists. The class of beings it designates is documented, attested, repeated in cuneiform texts across a long period. The root that connects Lilitu to the Hebrew Lilith is plausible. The cultural parallel between the Babylonian class of threatening female night spirits and the Jewish tradition of Lilith is real and suggestive. But the specific line of transmission, the claim that the Jewish Lilith descends directly and demonstrably from the Babylonian Lilitu through traceable textual and cultural channels, with the Gilgamesh prologue and the Arslan Tash amulets as the connecting evidence, that claim is much less certain than most people writing about Lilith's ancient origins will acknowledge. The ancient pedigree may be real. The proofs everyone uses to establish it are standing on thinner ground than they look like they're standing on. Now we reach something that connects every layer of this tradition: the Babylonian demon classes, the Talmudic warnings, the incantation bowls, the medieval story, in a way that no other thread does. Something so basic, so old, so enduring that it does not require any specific textual evidence to establish. A fear. The fear of a child not surviving its first days. In the ancient world, in every culture that has left enough material for us to read its fears, infant mortality was the most intimate catastrophe that most families faced. A child born was not yet a child survived. The first days were the most dangerous. The risk concentrated at the beginning, in the moment of birth, in the days immediately after, in the period before a child had proven itself stable in the world. And in a world where the biological causes of infant death, infection, prematurity, congenital conditions, the 1,000 ways that a small body can fail to sustain itself, were not understood as such, those deaths required a different explanation. Something took children, something came at night, something needed a name, a face, and a door that could be shut against it. The Babylonian demon Lamashtu is exactly this. She is documented. She is certain. Her name appears in dozens of cuneiform texts across more than 2,000 years of Babylonian and Assyrian religious life. She is described in specific physical detail: a face like a lion, the ears of a donkey. She crouches among pregnant women and among infants, and her countermeasures are well attested in the archaeological record. Amulets, figurines, ritual texts designed to drive her away. She is not Lilith, she is not the same being, but she is the same fear wearing Mesopotamian clothes, the threat to the newborn, the danger that waits in the first days, the thing that takes children before they have a chance to live. And when you hold Lamashtu and Lilith beside each other, when you look at them as answers to the same question that people in overlapping regions across overlapping centuries were trying to answer, the specific differences between them become less important than the structural similarity. In a world without germ theory, without neonatal intensive care, without the ability to explain why some children lived and others did not, the explanation had to be something else, something with a name, something that could be addressed, warned off, negotiated with, contained. Something that turned the shapeless terror of loss into a named opponent. Because a named opponent can be countered in ways that a shapeless terror cannot. There are beings in other traditions that answer the same fear in similar ways. In ancient Greek tradition, Lamia, a figure who preyed on children and who was warded against by specific protective measures, addressed the same basic anxiety. Roman tradition produced the Strix, a nocturnal creature that threatened infants and against whom households practiced various preventive rituals. Similar figures appear across Eurasia and the Middle East, the Persian Al, the Turkish Karakura, the Slavic Morava, and dozens of others whose names and details vary, while their essential function remains the same. The figure who comes in the night for the newborn is not unique to any single tradition. She is, in a sense, universal, not because all these traditions share a common source, but because all these traditions share a common condition. That condition is this: in the ancient world, and in much of the early modern world, and in many parts of the world within living memory, a significant proportion of children did not survive their first weeks. They died of infections that are now trivially preventable. They died of conditions that are now treatable. They died of causes that even their parents could not see, let alone name. And in a world where the invisible causes of suffering are not yet visible, they become invisible agents, beings, presences, forces that operate in the dark by rules that can be learned and countered. The figure with the wild hair and the bound hands is not a monster in the modern sense. She is an explanation. She is the face that a community put on something that otherwise had no face at all. Every bowl is that gesture. Every amulet, every writ of divorce, addressed to Lilith on behalf of a couple whose children had died, or might die, or were being born into a household that had already known grief. The technology varies across cultures and centuries. The underlying act is the same: naming the fear, giving it a face, and then addressing the face directly. We are almost at the deepest layer tonight. There is one more thing to find before we start back up. The three names: Senoi, Sansenoi, Semangelof. These are the names of the three angels in the famous story. The angels God sends to the Red Sea to bring Lilith back, whose names she agrees to spare from her. They appear in the alphabet of Ben Sira, in the 9th or 10th century. They have been, since then, the primary protective formula in the Jewish amulet tradition against Lilith. The names written on paper and pinned above a newborn's crib, the names inscribed above a door, the names that, according to the story, compel her to leave the household alone. Those three names appear on 6th century Aramaic incantation bowls. The bowls predate the alphabet of Ben Sira by at least 300 years. The names are older than the story that explains them. Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangelof were already being written on protective objects, already being buried in house foundations, already being trusted to keep Lilith away from infants, before anyone had written down a story explaining who those angels were or why their names had any power over her. What were those names before they were the names of the angels in the alphabet of Ben Sira? We don't know. Their etymology is disputed. They don't obviously derive from any standard Hebrew or Aramaic root, and their meaning, if they had one in the original tradition, has been lost. They may be older than the protective tradition itself. They may have been borrowed from some other ritual system and applied to this one. They may have acquired their meaning through use, through the fact that they were used for protection across enough generations that the using became the meaning, the history became irrelevant, and what mattered was only that these names, specifically these 3 names in this specific order, kept the night at bay. The protection is older than the explanation. The angels are older than the tale that named them. And the fear, which is the oldest thing of all, is older than any of it. Keep going. We're almost at the place where everything comes together. We're almost back at the houses. It is late in the night now, later than it was when we began. The momentum of the walk has brought us somewhere deeper than the surface, and the room where you are listening to this, wherever that room is, whatever city, whatever hour, is probably darker and quieter than it was at the beginning. Things have settled. The day has receded. What is left is the night, and the thread of the story, and the slow images that the story leaves behind. The images are slower, and the room is quieter, and the particular quality of attention that belongs to the deepest hours has settled. This is the hour when the surface noise of the day has finally dissolved completely, when what remains is only the essential, the breathing of people you love, the small sounds a house makes when it is very quiet, the quality of dark that is different from the dark of earlier in the evening. This is the hour that belonged to those households in Nippur. Let's go there, not as a historian visiting a site, but as someone entering a room that is still, somehow, present, because the objects are still present, because the clay is still in drawers in museums, because the ink on the clay is still legible, because the names are still names. Geonai bar mamai, Rashnoi, names that someone spoke and thought and worried about and loved 15 centuries ago in a house that is now only a shape in the soil. The house itself was modest by any standard, mud brick walls, built thick enough to stay cool in the summer heat. A main room and a smaller back room, possibly an inner courtyard open to the sky, a way of catching the night air when the days were longest. Flat roof, accessible by a ladder, where the family might sleep in summer when the interior walls still held the heat of the afternoon. A threshold with a wooden lintel, or perhaps just a beam of palm wood. A doorway low enough that you have to duck your head to enter, which is practical in a climate where keeping the heat out matters more than the ease of passage. The lamp in the corner is oil, olive oil or sesame oil, burning in a small clay bowl or a simple terracotta lamp with a pinched spout, giving enough light to work by and no more. The light it throws is warm and yellow and limited. At its edges the room resolves into shadow. The scribe has come to the house with his materials, or the bowl has been commissioned at his workshop and brought home by a member of the household. Either way, the object is here now, complete. The spiral of writing wound inward from the rim to the centre, the formula of divorce in its correct legal form, the names that bind the document to this household and to this client, and to this specific named threat. And at the centre, the drawing, a woman with loose hair, constrained by the words that surround her on every side, held in place by the vortex of ink. The bowl is turned face down. Someone, perhaps the head of the household, perhaps the scribe as part of his service, digs up the corner of the floor. The earth here is packed and dry and has been walked on for years. The digging is not deep, just enough. The bowl goes in, opening toward the earth, and the earth goes back over it, and the floor is smooth again. It looks the way it always looked. There is no visible mark of what has been done. And the household goes to sleep, in the knowledge that the threshold is covered, and the corners are covered, and the place beneath the bed is covered, and that whatever comes in the night will have to get past the words before it can get to the people the words protect. Now, I told you we would come back to 3 names. Here they are: Senoi, Sansanoi, Semangilof. You've been holding them since early in the night, Since the moment I first named them and asked you to keep them, here is why they matter. The alphabet of Ben Sira, the text from the 9th or 10th century, the one that introduces the story of Lilith and Adam and the Red Sea, tells us that God sent 3 angels to bring Lilith back to the garden. Their names are Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangaloth. And Lilith at the Red Sea agrees. Any infant whose home displays those 3 names will be safe from her. She will not touch them. On the basis of that story, families inscribed those 3 names on protective amulets and placed them above their newborns. The practice is well attested from the medieval period onward, from North Africa to the Rhineland, from Spain to Poland. The 3 names became the standard formula of protection against Lilith in Jewish household ritual, present across a remarkable geographic range and sustained over many centuries. And those 3 names appear on 6th century incantation bowls. The bowls are from the 6th century. The alphabet of Ben Sira, the text that introduces those names in a narrative context, was written in the 9th or 10th century. The names predate the story by at minimum 300 years. They were being written on protective objects and buried in house foundations before the story that supposedly gives them their meaning existed. This is the single fact in tonight's argument that carries the most weight. Not the disputed etymology, not the contested dating of the Arslan Tash amulets, not the scholarly debate about the alphabet's tone. This. The names were older than the story. The protection was practiced before the explanation for the protection existed. What were the names before they were the names of the 3 angels? We don't know. Their meaning before the alphabet assigned them a narrative context is genuinely unknown. They may have originated in a different ritual tradition altogether, been absorbed into this one, and only later been given angelic identities and a backstory. Or they may have circulated in an oral tradition that ran parallel to the written one, present in practice but not in text, carried in household memory rather than in manuscripts. What we can say is that the alphabet of Ben Sira, in Sholom's reading, looked at those names already in use and wrote a story to explain why they were in use. The story didn't create the practice. The story explained a practice that was already in place. And in explaining it, in giving the names a narrative home, the story made the practice permanent in a new way. It gave families a reason to continue using those names, a theological justification for what had previously been, perhaps, simply custom. Think about what that means for how a tradition survives. For 300 years, perhaps longer, households across Mesopotamia used those 3 names on protective objects without having the story that gives them meaning. They had the formula. They trusted the formula. They passed the formula from parent to child across generations. And at some point, 3 centuries into the life of that formula, a text appeared that explained it. That gave the names faces and biographies, and a relationship to the creation story, and a logic that connected them to the named threat. And then the tradition had both, the practice that preceded the explanation, and the explanation that made the practice intelligible to everyone who encountered it afterward. This is how traditions work. A practice exists. A story explains the practice. The story then sustains the practice in a new form. The practice sustains the story. And together, practice and story, they travel forward through time, from community to community, from century to century, from one kind of dark into another. The 3 names traveled far. Paper amulets bearing the names of Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangaloth were produced throughout the medieval Jewish world, in Tunis, in Cairo, in Rome, in Cologne, in Prague, in Vilna, in communities that had no direct cultural connection to the incantation bowl tradition of Sasanian Mesopotamia, but that shared, through the medium of text and through the movement of people and practice, the same basic fear and the same basic protective formula. You can trace the names moving westward and northward with the diaspora, appearing in manuscript collections, in printed books, in handwritten notes tucked into the margins of prayer books, in small objects made for individual households. By the early modern period, protective amulets against Lilith were a feature of Jewish domestic life across the Mediterranean world and into northern Europe. In many communities, they were standard practice for any birth, an inscribed piece of paper or a small printed card pinned to the wall of the room where the mother and child were confined during the first days. The specific details varied. Different communities had different formulas, different additions to the core protective text, different ways of framing the request. But the three names were almost always present. 300 years of incantation bowls, then a gap in the textual record, then the medieval story, then the paper amulets, a tradition with a 3,000-year run, from clay to paper, from Nippur to Frankfurt, from the 5th century to the 20th. What that run represents is not the continuity of a story. The story changed many times. The characters around Lilith shifted. She acquired a consort in the medieval Kabbalistic tradition, a place in a cosmological system, a set of philosophical and theological attributes that the scribe in Nippur making bowls would not have recognized. The Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah, composed in Spain in the late 13th century, contains dozens of references to Lilith and elaborates her role in ways that go far beyond anything in the alphabet of Ben Sira. The Kabbalists gave her a place in the structure of reality itself, not merely a place in the story of creation. What is continuous across all of that change is not the character or the story, it is the fear and the response. Think about what it is to lie awake in a room with a newborn. You know this experience, or you can imagine it, the specific quality of wakefulness that belongs to those nights, the way a sound that you would sleep through any other time, a creak of the floor, a change in the weather, a shift in the rhythm of breathing from the crib, brings you upright and listening in an instant. The way the darkness in a room with a sleeping infant is different from the darkness of any other room. Something in you is alert in a way that does not turn off, that cannot be reasoned with, that operates below and beside the rational mind rather than through it. Because the thing you care about most is also the most fragile thing, and you know that, and the knowledge lives in your body rather than in your thoughts. Every household in Nippur knew that feeling. Every parent who sat awake in the hour after the city had gone quiet, in the room where the lamp was burning down and the infant was sleeping, and the floor was sealed with words, they knew that feeling, and the bowl gave them, if not certainty, then something that functions in the absence of certainty, action, something to do, a gesture between themselves and whatever they could not prevent. The technology has changed past recognition, the gesture has not. The bowl in the floor and the lock checked twice before bed are different expressions of the same thing. A person who loves something, taking whatever action is available, making the house feel safe enough to sleep in. When this is understood, when the tradition is understood as organized primarily around a fear and a response, rather than around a narrative or a character, then the academic disputes about origins become secondary. Whether the Jewish Lilith descended from the Babylonian Lilitu or shares only a linguistic family resemblance with it, it changes the scholarly picture of the tradition, but it does not change what the bowls are. It does not change what Geonai bar Mamai and Rashnoi were doing when they paid a scribe and took a bowl home. They were doing what people do, in every century and in every language, when they love something too much to leave it unprotected. The brush finishes its last stroke. The drawing is complete. The bowl is done. It will dry through the rest of the night, and in the morning it will go into the ground, face down, patient, waiting. The house will feel, for a little while, like enough. Now let's come back up, slowly. The way you surface from deep water, carrying what you found. Let's say plainly what we know, not what the tradition claims, not what the popular accounts assert, not what the most dramatic reading suggests, but what the evidence, examined carefully and honestly, actually shows. This is the part of the night that earns its keep. The long walk backwards has brought us to the place where we can say something true, something that accounts for the evidence that is there, acknowledges the evidence that is not, and holds the uncertainty without collapsing into vagueness. The shape of the thing, as best as the scholarship can reach it, this is the part of the night where we come back to solid ground, the real objects, the real texts, the real hands that made things, the real households that used them. Before we do, pay off one more loop. The divorce document. I asked you to remember it earlier, when we were in segment 4, when we first read the bowl for Geonai bar Mamai and Rashnoi. I said, this is a divorce document. Hold that. We come back to it. Here we are. In the religious and legal world of Babylonian Jewish communities, words had power because words created obligations. A marriage was a binding legal relationship, not merely a social arrangement or an emotional bond, but a formal covenant with rights and duties on both sides, enforceable within the community's legal structures. A divorce was the formal dissolution of that covenant, a legal instrument with correct formulas and proper witnesses that changed the status of two people in relation to each other and in relation to the community. A get was not a statement of intent. It was a legal act with real-world consequences, and it worked because the law recognized it and the community upheld the law. To write a get addressed to Lilith is to grant her standing in that legal system. It is to treat her as a party with the capacity to receive a document, to be bound by its formulas, to be obligated by its terms. You cannot serve legal papers on a hurricane, because a hurricane has no standing, no capacity, no legal personhood. You can only serve papers on something that can receive them, something that exists within a framework of rights and obligations, something that is, in some sense, a party. The households that commissioned the divorce bowls were not thinking of Lilith as a monster in the modern sense, a pure force of destruction, mindless, beyond negotiation. They were thinking of her as something more like an illegal tenant, a presence in the household that had no right to be there, but one that had legal reality, could be addressed in legal terms, could be required to leave by proper procedure. The bowl is an eviction notice, a correct and formal eviction notice, served through holy angels, dissolving whatever claim she had on this particular household and its particular inhabitants. This is a deeply human way of thinking about a threat. It domesticates it, not in the sense of making it seem harmless, but in the sense of bringing it within the framework of the ordinary. The ordinary framework of Babylonian Jewish life was legal. Rights and obligations, properly formulated and properly witnessed, governed everything from commerce to marriage to inheritance to religious observance. To address Lilith within that framework was to assert that she was subject to it, that even the most threatening thing that came in the night was still part of a world governed by laws, still addressable through the instruments that governed everything else. There is something reassuring in that, even at a distance of 15 centuries. Not reassuring in the sense of making the fear seem smaller, but reassuring in the sense of making the world seem coherent. A world in which even the night's most dangerous residents can be served with proper paperwork is a world with more structure than a world in which the dark has no rules at all. Now let's lay out the layers, in order, from the oldest to the most recent, carefully, without compression, because the whole of tonight has been building to this moment, and it deserves to be stated plainly before we let it go. At the bottom, the Akkadian religious tradition, spanning roughly 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization before the Common Era. In that tradition, there is a class of beings called Lilitu, female spirits associated with wind, with night, with the threatening of women and children. Their nature is specific. They are not general demons, but beings with particular associations, particular victims, particular countermeasures. The word may or may not be the etymological ancestor of the Hebrew Lilith. Scholars disagree, and the disagreement is genuine, not merely technical. The cultural parallel is clear. The specific line of descent is contested. The two famous pieces of evidence cited to establish that line, the Gilgamesh Huluputri appendix and the Arslan Tash amulets, are both disputed by recent scholarship. The root may be real, the proof is thin. Above that, one contested word in the book of Isaiah, in a destruction poem about Edom, in a list of desert creatures, possibly a proper name, possibly a common noun meaning night creature, translated 5 different ways by 5 different Bible versions. Not a narrative reference, not a theological statement, not evidence of any specific belief about a specific being, simply a word in a list, in a poem, that may or may not be her name. Above that, the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the last few centuries before the Common Era. The Songs of the Sage lists Liliths, plural, in a catalogue of threatening spirits. A category, not an individual. A type of being, not a named character. The tradition at this stage is a class of threat, not yet a biography. Above that, the Babylonian Talmud, compiled and edited into something like its final form in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. Scattered references, the warning about sleeping alone, the physical description with wings and hair, the category and discussions of birth anomalies. A recognizable figure, acquiring specificity, but still without a narrative. The Talmud assumes its readers know what Lilith is. It does not explain her origin. Above that, the Incantation bowls, from the 5th through perhaps the 8th century of the Common Era. Here the evidence is dense, specific, material, and archaeological. Thousands of objects, thousands of clients named, thousands of legal documents addressed to a named defendant, professional scribes, established formulas, a commercial practice embedded in Jewish household life in Mesopotamia. The 3 angel names already in use on 6th century bowls, centuries before the story that will eventually explain them. The practice is fully formed. The explanation is not yet written. Above that, the alphabet of Ben Sira, from the 9th or 10th century. The biography. The garden, the dispute, the flight, the Red Sea, the angels, the pact. The story that explains everything that came before it. The story that may be a parody, that may be genuine folk tradition, that may be, in Skolam's reading, a conscious etiology composed to account for a practice that needed accounting for. The story that became, against all probability, the most influential text in the subsequent history of this tradition. Above that, the Kabbalists. Isaac ben Jacob HaKohen, writing in 13th century Spain, in his treatise on the left emanation, giving Lilith a consort, Samael, and placing her within a cosmological framework of evil. The Zohar, compiled by Moses de Leon in the late 13th century in Castile, extending and deepening that framework across dozens of references, making Lilith a permanent figure in the architecture of Jewish mysticism. Maimonides and Menachem Mary, in the same tradition, rejecting her existence as theological error, both impulses, to take her seriously and to dismiss her, alive in the same centuries, in the same communities. And then the modern chapter. One paragraph as promised, because it is reception history and not origin history, and because the conversation it opens is still open and belongs to people living inside it, rather than to a late-night documentary looking at it from outside. What is worth noting before we leave the Kabbalistic layer is how thoroughly that tradition transformed what came before it. The Zohar and the Kabbalists of 13th century Spain did not simply preserve the Lilith of the Incantation bowls, or the Lilith of the alphabet of Ben Sira. They remade her. They gave her a place in a cosmological architecture, a theory of the structure of divine reality and its shadow, of the way light and darkness are not opposites but complements, of the left side of the divine tree and the right side, of Samael and Lilith as the dark mirror of the divine couple. The Lilith of the Zohar is a theological figure, a piece of a mystical system, in a way that the Lilith of the bowls is not. The bowls are about households. The Zohar is about the structure of the cosmos. And yet, despite that transformation, despite the fact that the Zohar's Lilith and the bowl scribe's Lilith are barely the same figure, the three angel names survived: Senoi, Sansonoi, Semangaloth. They passed through the alphabet of Ben Sira, through the Kabbalistic elaboration, through the early modern printing press, and the spread of Jewish protective literature, and they arrived, still legible, still in use, in Jewish communities across the world into the 20th century. The theological framework around them changed completely. The names stayed. In the 20th century, Lilith was taken up as a cultural figure in ways none of these communities would have recognized. She became a symbol of female independence and self-determination in certain streams of second-wave feminism, a figure who refused the role assigned to her and paid the price, and refused to regret it. She became a therapeutic image, an archetype, a way of naming a part of the self that won't submit. She acquired a magazine, a music festival, a place in a remarkable range of popular fiction and film and television and game design. She became, in some circles, a figure of religious veneration, claimed by traditions that regard the older mythology with respect and work within it consciously. All of that is real, none of it is false. It is what happens to a name that has been in the air for 2,500 years. It accumulates, in each century, whatever that century needs it to mean. What is continuous in all of this is not the character, which changed beyond recognition between the Incantation bowls and the 21st century. What is continuous is the fear and the practice and the human impulse that generated both. The fear of a child not surviving, the fear of a house that isn't safe at night, the need to name that fear, to give it standing, to address it in whatever form and with whatever tools the century has available. The need to do something, anything that feels like enough, in the face of something that cannot be fully controlled. Real scribes, real clay, real ink, real names, geonai, rashnoi, real money that changed hands, real decisions about which corner of the floor, which threshold, which spot beneath the bed where the birth was going to happen, people who dug up their own floors with their own hands, or watched while the scribe did it, or paid someone else to make the house feel safer than it was. They did not know whether it worked. They could not know. The bowls that have survived into museum collections are the ones that were never disturbed, the ones whose households stayed intact long enough for the structure to be built over and the object to be sealed in place by layers of subsequent occupation. The bowls that were dug up again, by later inhabitants who found something unexpected under the floor, or by the families themselves when they moved, or by chance, are gone, lost to the ordinary attrition of time. We have the bowls that stayed. We do not have a record of whether the households that buried them fared better or worse than the households that did not. That uncertainty was presumably present at the time as well. People commissioned bowls, and children still died. People did not commission bowls, and their children survived. The efficacy of the practice was not provable in any way that the commissioning household could test. What the bowl provided was not evidence of protection. It provided the experience of having acted, the feeling that the perimeter had been addressed, the threshold acknowledged, the legal formality observed. The same thing the door check provides, the same thing the light left on in the hallway provides, not proof, action. People who lay awake in the hours after midnight listening to the breathing of their children, hoping the formula was right, hoping the names were sufficient, hoping the bowl in the ground was doing what they paid for it to do. The story is medieval, the fear is as old as parents, and the bowl is still in the ground, in the dark, quiet, exactly where they put it. And now let's come back to you. Wherever you are tonight, whatever city, whatever country, whatever hour, you do something before you sleep. A small thing, something habitual, something that might not even rise to the level of conscious awareness anymore, because you've done it so many nights in a row that your body does it before your mind has decided to. Something that makes the house feel right before you close your eyes. The last door check. Not because you believe something is outside, you probably don't. Not in any explicit or conscious way. Not as a named threat with legal standing. Not as a being that can be served with paperwork and required to leave. But because the checking matters in a way that has nothing to do with belief. The act of going to the door and putting your hand on the handle and feeling the lock under your fingers changes the quality of the night. The house is the same after the checking as it was before. The risk, such as it is unchanged. And yet something in the night feels different after the check. Smaller maybe, more contained. The boundary between inside and outside, which was already there, has been acknowledged. You leave a light on in the hallway, not for any practical reason, not because you need it to navigate in the dark, you know this house well enough for that, but because the light is a presence, a small, warm, steady presence that is there when you're not looking, that keeps a corner of the dark from being complete. You arrange things. The glass of water on the bedside table, in the place where it always goes. The phone at a particular angle, screen down so the room is dark. The blanket pulled to a specific place, just so, the weight of it distributed in a way that means sleep is possible. You check on the sleeping person in the next room. You have checked already tonight, 20 minutes ago, and you know they're fine, and you check again. You stand in the doorway. You listen for breathing. You stand very still until you hear it. And when you hear it, you do not go back to bed immediately. You stand there a moment longer, because the hearing of it is not enough. You need to hear it again, and then you go. These are not superstitions. Nobody is accusing you of superstition. These are gestures. They are the modern form of the oldest gesture in the world. The rational mind will tell you that the door was already locked before you checked it, and that checking it again has changed nothing about the probability that something comes through it in the night. The rational mind is right, and the checking happens anyway, not because the rational mind is wrong, but because the checking is not addressed to the rational mind. It is addressed to something older and more immediate, the part of you that does not sleep, that is awake when everything else has gone still, the part that knows, with a certainty that has nothing to do with calculation, that some things are too important to leave to probability alone. You make your circles. You trace the perimeter of the house. You account for everyone inside it. And when the circles are complete, when everyone has been accounted for, the house is different, not measurably safer, different in a way that is not measurable, that lives in the body rather than the mind, in the quality of the exhale, when you finally let yourself lie down and stay down. That is what the bowl was for. Not certainty. The households at Nippur had already learned what the world was capable of. They were not expecting certainty. They were expecting what the last door check gives you, the completed circle, the acknowledged perimeter, the exhale. They are the same gesture that Gaonai Bar Mamai made when he carried the bowl home from the scribe and placed it in the corner of the floor. They are the same gesture the Rhineland family made when they pinned the paper amulet with the 3 angel names above the crib in 1642. They are the same gesture the Nippur household made in the 5th century when they chose the corner rather than the threshold, when they dug the ground themselves, when they replaced the earth carefully so the floor looked undisturbed. The technology has changed beyond all comparison. The reasoning is different. The conscious content is entirely different. The underlying act is the same. A person who loves something, taking the action that is available, making the house feel safe enough to sleep in. That's what all of it is. Not superstition, not irrationality, not something primitive that we have evolved beyond. The same thing in every century, in every household, in every room where someone lies awake when the dark is full. The naming of the fear, the gesture that acknowledges it, the small act that draws the boundary and says, "Here, inside this line, we are protected enough, we are safe enough, we can rest." Every one of those bowls was that act. Every one of those 3,000 objects, buried face down in the foundations of houses that are now only shapes in the soil of southern Iraq. Every one of them was a person doing what you do, in the most formal and legal and textually elaborate form available to their century. You're not so different from them. 15 centuries apart, in a world they could not have imagined and a room they will never see, you are doing the same thing they did. The technology changed. The gesture didn't. If tonight has given you something, a different sense of where this story comes from, a different relationship to the bowls and the scribes and the households that commissioned them, a sense of the fear that runs through all of it and the response to that fear that runs through all of it, then you can let the algorithm know with a gentle tap on the like button. It's quiet. It takes a second. And what it does is tell the platform that this kind of night is worth putting in front of people who might need it. Leave a comment. When you wake up, or right now if you're still here, tell me where in the world you are and what hour it is there. Tell me whether you check the door, or leave a light on, or check on someone who is sleeping. Tell me what small thing you do that makes the house feel safe enough to sleep in. Those comments matter. I read them in the mornings. And if you want more nights like this one, more long, slow walks backwards through a story that turns out to be older and stranger and more human than anyone expected, subscribing is a quiet tap. The membership is for the ones who want to go deeper, to support the work directly, to be part of the community that these videos are building, one night at a time. All of it is optional. Listening is enough. Being here, in this hour, in this particular darkness, that's already the right thing. Now, there is a bowl. It might be in a museum drawer in London, wrapped in acid-free tissue, with a small card attached giving a catalogue number and a provenance and a date. It might be in a display case in a university building, behind glass, with a label in small text that a visitor might glance at and move on. It might be in a storage room in Baghdad, or Jerusalem, or New Haven, in a box with other objects from the same excavation, waiting for a researcher who will take it out and look at it carefully, more carefully than it has been looked at before. And it might still be in the ground, somewhere in the flat plain of southern Iraq, in the foundations of a house that was a house 15 centuries ago and is now only a compressed shape in the alluvial soil, waiting for an excavation that has not happened yet, waiting in the dark under the earth that was replaced over it when the household set it down, in a room that no longer exists, in a city that is now a series of low mounds visible from a distance only if you know what you're looking for. The mound that was a house, on top of the mound that was an older house, on top of the mound that was an older house still, history compressed into a vertical column of soil, with the bowl somewhere in the stratum that corresponds to a particular century, in a darkness that has never been interrupted since the day the earth was pressed back over it. Wherever it is still upside down. The spiral of writing is still inside it, still wound from the rim toward the center, each line following the curve of the clay, each line slightly shorter than the one before, the words accumulating in their slow inward gyre until they reach the center and stop, and at the center, the figure. The woman with the dishevelled hair, the hands that might be bound, the gesture that says, "You are contained here, You are addressed here. You have been served with papers here, and this is the document that records your departure. The names are still on the clay. Geonai bar mamai. Rashnoi. Names that real people wore, that real voices spoke, that real hands wrote down with a steady brush in the warm circle of lamplight, 15 centuries ago, in a room that the next morning looked exactly the same as it had looked before. The scribe is gone. The house is gone. The city of Nippur as a living community is gone. It collapsed slowly over the centuries following the Islamic conquest, its population dispersing, its buildings deteriorating, its streets gradually filling with wind-blown silt, until the flat plain reasserted itself, and the mounds were all that was left. Everyone who lived in that house and loved someone in that house and lay awake in that house in the hours after midnight listening for breathing, all of them are gone. What remains is the object, the clay, the ink, the intention, pressed into the earth with careful hands, still doing what it was made to do. The three names are still there: Senoi, Sansenoi, Semangelof, written by a hand that has been dust for more than 1,000 years, in a language that belongs to no living community's daily speech, on a surface that was meant to be pressed into the earth and left there and not looked at again. Those names were already old when the scribe wrote them, already ancient custom, already separated from whatever origin they had by centuries of use. They are old beyond reckoning now, and they are still there, on the clay, in the dark, in the ground that has been holding them since before anyone living was born. The story is medieval. The fear is as old as parents. And the bowl is still upside down, in the dark, in the earth, patient where they put it. Whatever they thought was under it has been very quiet for 15 centuries. The names have been doing their work in the dark for 15 centuries. The formula has been correct for 15 centuries. The story can wait until morning. The layers we walked through tonight can wait until morning. The Akkadian lily too and the contested etymology, the one verse in Isaiah and the ambiguous translation, the Dead Sea Scrolls with their plural Liliths, the Talmud's scattered and practical warnings, the bowls in the earth with their spirals of Aramaic and their figures of bound women, the alphabet of Ben Sira and its medieval biography, the three names that were older than the story that named them. All of that can wait. It has been waiting. It is patient in the way that only things made of clay and ink and compressed time can be patient. The questions that we raised and didn't answer, because the scholars haven't answered them either, because the evidence doesn't settle them, because the most important questions in any tradition are the ones that remain genuinely open, rather than the ones that have been foreclosed by confident answers. Those questions can wait until morning too. Where the names came from before the story existed to explain them, whether the Jewish Lilith descended from the Babylonian Lilitu or simply shares a family resemblance, whether the alphabet of Ben Sira was parody or testimony, whether there was ever an oral tradition that carried the story before it was written down. Those questions have been waiting for 1,000 years. They will wait a few more hours. The floor can wait until morning. The threshold can wait until morning. The world can wait until morning. The bowl is still upside down. Whatever they believed was held beneath it. Whatever form the fear took in the mind of the scribe making the figure, in the mind of the household carrying the bowl home, in the mind of the mother lying awake above the floor where it was buried, has been held in place for 15 centuries by a few strokes of ink on fired clay. The names of angels written in a hand that is dust. The name of a defendant served with papers and commanded to leave. A legal document, executed with the correct formulas, filed in the earth under a house in a city that is now only mounds. It has been very quiet. The story can wait until morning. The questions can wait until morning. The bowl can wait. For now, you can rest.